Hello, welcome to Art Talks with Al Ninot. Catch up with the latest Art Talks, conversations, interviews on contemporary art in Ghana. These episodes are recordings of Art Talks, art seminars, interviews gathered from different art spaces in Ghana and around the world.
Salah Hassan here. He's been so important in the whole creation of the contemporary African art narrative and its mediation. I studied him when I was at university. Yep. He's been really important in my formation. So when I met him this weekend, he was only here for a few days. I asked him and pleaded with him to come in and kind of share his presence with some of us. As you will all know, I only posted about it this morning, so it's great that we've got such a great turnout. It's a tribute to Salah's resonance, I think, that there are so many of you here. I told him that most of you are artists and curators. I don't know, do you want to know a bit more about the audience before we talk? Or? Sorry?
We were already taking hands.
I think I asked them earlier.
Okay, so, yeah. So we're just going to have an informal conversation. I'm going to ask Salah some questions. Please feel free to chip in anything that you want to know. I know there's a lot of budding curators here as well who could kind of benefit from his wisdom. So chip in as and when you want to. Okay, hi Salah.
How are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
Let me start by saying that thank you so much anyway for having me here. I'm actually honored and pleased. And I think the stars have aligned because I have been checking. My visit here is really not a formal visit, not for research. I'm just accompanying family. But I wanted to check the Accra scene, the Ghana scene. And I've heard a lot of great things about what's happening here, and specifically you. And I've asked Francis, Obudai, and he said no, he's heading to England, but he will make sure that to get in touch with you. But the stars have aligned, so I end up in this place in Obor, is that where it is?
In Abury.
And then I was told that there is a young curator, an artist who is going to be staying in the same guest house that I'm staying, which is
the tree house.
Turned out to be good, because once he mentioned our name, of course, I said, that's the person I was looking for, and I was actually looking forward to meet you. So it worked out very well.
Yeah, serendipity.
There's something spiritual about it.
Yeah, I was actually going to get away from the art world, and I went right into its arms to try and get some writing done. But it was really serendipitous.
Yeah. No, it was a good introduction. Now, I'm really happy to be here. So you guys feel free. If you want me to start in any way that you can, I'm happy. But I can maybe just say a few words about myself, that things that you may not know. As an introduction, some of you probably know that I'm from Sudan. Born in the southern part of Sudan, the city of Juba. Grew up there partially due to the civil war. I'm supposedly from the north. I'm someone who's against the whole partition of Sudan for reasons we can discuss if you wish later. Anyway, but I grew up in Sudan. I studied at the University of Khartoum. In my early days, I was a painter in high school. I really wanted to study fine arts. I was accepted in the college, but never managed to pursue it because at the time my mother thought being a doctor, being a professional engineer or something is the best option. So I tried the medical school. I was in the early days, or whatever they call it, the pre-clinical. And then did the 2 years, never really failed. I could have studied medicine if I wanted to, but I felt it wasn't for me. Because I always wanted to be an artist. That was my dream. But then I couldn't do it, and so I opted to move from the Faculty of Science, which is the College of Science in Sudan, with basic science, to what they call it, the faculty part. Then they call it, it's the British system, rather than college, they call it faculty. So I ended up studying philosophy. Don't ask me why, because I just didn't know. Actually, growing up, I had no dream of a specific profession other than an artist. I was never the person who wanted to be a doctor or engineer or lawyer and so forth. So I was the odd person in the family and probably in my generation. In any case, I ended up studying philosophy. I did what they call it on a degree, and looking into the newspaper about possibilities after I finished. What do you do with the philosophy degrees, then, even if you have an honor? So there was an advertise, interestingly, to teach art history at the College of Fine and Applied Art in Khartoum, which is a very old college, established in the 1930s, and in the 40s it became a full-fledged college, known as the School of Design first, then it became the College of Fine and Applied Art. I was hired to establish, with another colleague, the art history department. And so I got the chance of going abroad on a scholarship, went to the University of Pennsylvania, did my doctorate there, and with all intentions of going back. The reason simply is that in 1989, when I finished, there was a military coup carried by fundamentalists, mostly Muslim fundamentalists, and they basically went into purging universities and colleges from any professor who is not within their realm of thinking or within their political party and so forth. So I opted to wait abroad, work for a few years, and it's still with the dream of going back to Sudan. Anyway, things didn't change in Sudan. He is the same guy that's still in the military. Hopefully he will follow in the footsteps of Mugabe and others. But who knows? He may be reach up to 90. He's still in his late 70s, probably early 80s. In any case, that's my early history. I ended up teaching at the State University of Buffalo art history. Then I was recruited by Cornell University, and I taught there between the Africana studies, which is African American studies, and I thought it was a very good place to be, and in the art history department. Years later, I ended up directing them, both of them successively. And it was an interesting experience. That for me, I can talk about it later if you wish to, is that for an African to head a typical traditional classical artist department, how do you deal with it? How do you change it? Because you suddenly find yourself the Africanist in the bunch, or the African Americanist in the bunch, in an art history that is basically follow the European linear line of succession, from ancient to modern, what they call it from rock to pop. So how do you really position yourself? How do you think about change within a department like this with limited lines that follow the European evolution of art, or linear how art history are constructed, with basically ancient, classic, or moving into the medieval period, the modern and the contemporary. And it's all European. Appointments like in African studies, Indian art, Asian art, normally token representation, and they are considered what they call it, some of you who studied in any liberal art college there, this would be what we call an un-Western or diversity requirement. So I'll get to that, of how the struggle to change that, because I was given a special appointment of 5 years with the charge of changing. I will get to that later on, but that's how I find myself gradually as an Africanist that curating becomes a necessity. Because if you are interested in the classical African art, it's studied mostly by Europeans, based on collections in the West. So if you think about the art history as a discipline when I entered it, which is basically early to mid-90s, it was a very Eurocentric field dominated by white scholars who are interested in the classical field. So you find yourself suddenly that you are interested in the modern and in the contemporary because of my own background as a painter and trying to maneuver your way of how do you really change the field and how do you work it out and so on. So I found that the field of curating is the best option of moving into the field because if you think about European artists, those who study Renaissance and others, there is a library, there are museums, there is already text that are written. But how do you deal with the contemporary and the modern in Africa? Because the very raw material itself doesn't exist. So exhibitions becomes a necessity for me. And that's why I always say, if you want to really write that history, you have to exhibit it first. You have to create the very raw material from which you can theorize or canonize either artists or... So curating becomes one avenue. Publishing, doing research and publishing in that field become also another avenue to pursue. And that's what led us, myself and colleagues, and perhaps I will stop here. That's how I ended in the field of curating and ended up straddling the two fields. And luckily I've been in a department, whether it's African studies at Cornell or art history, where I had the flexibility. And curating becomes a respectable position or profession within art history itself as a discipline. Because most people now, even those who really follow the traditional classical art history, found that curating, even from a European perspective, those who do the contemporary found curating is very rewarding because that's where you can create, as I said, the very raw material. You can stage artists and movement, and you can gradually canonize them and insert them within the larger narrative of artists. I'll stop here. I have the tendency to digress, like any teacher. So feel free to stop this conference.
I'm finding this fascinating because you're articulating in a way. I feel like like kind of what I'm doing here now and what we're doing now comes kind of out of what you and Okwi and Olu and everyone were doing in the West, in a way. And I feel like what we're all doing here is kind of the next step from what you were doing. Like, you kind of led us to this. Yeah. And so it's just really interesting how you're articulating. Personally, I feel like an art historian, I don't really like curating because I don't like organizing or putting things together, but I end up always doing it, like you say, out of necessity. Because I feel like it's so important that we are the creators of our own narrative at this point. And I feel like your particular experience is so interesting because I feel like before you almost, there wasn't anyone. There wasn't anyone of African descent or in the mainstream narrative steering the conversation. And
So to tell you, okay, you are right. For example, when myself and Okwi and Chico Opeke and Oluwegwibe, this is like the really first generation, and then this is within the United States. But then outside the United States, at the time, there was Simone Njame in Paris, and that was it actually. I mean, there might be other people, but they didn't probably enter the mainstream, and it was very difficult for them. So, but within other fields, there are things that are actually very interesting. To give you an example, when you think about modernity, you either think of it, and specifically African modernity. Like for me, the question and the challenge when I was in graduate school is how do you think of African modernity or non-Western modernity in general? And how do you see writing? Because the main paradigm at the time is that African modernism, or African modernism in general, has been a derivative of the Western experience. It was always a North-South movement. Is that artists studied abroad or studied in Western colleges that are established, like, for example, the Khartoum School of Fine and lot of